Next, we'll be taking a look at the various types of disasters, the reasons for their occurrence, what are their impacts, how vulnerable is India towards these disasters, and what are the steps that have been taken or that can be taken to mitigate the impacts of these disasters. We'll first start with earthquake. Now, when we think about a disaster, most of us get earthquake in our minds, right? The first disaster that comes in our mind is that of earthquakes. So, why do earthquakes exactly occur? And what is an earthquake? Earthquake is shaking or trembling of the earth's surface. Shaking. The earth's surface, the ground that we are standing on, over which our infrastructure has been built, it starts shaking or trembling. And any kind of such activity is known as an earthquake. Now, this is caused by seismic waves or earthquake waves that are generated due to sudden movement or sudden release in energy in the earth's crust or in its upper mantle. Now, there can be multiple reasons due to which earthquakes can be caused. These can be plate tectonics. Now, plate tectonics is the most common reason for occurrence of earthquakes, and most of the earthquake prone zones are actually located on the active plate boundaries. That is, those boundaries of these plates which are moving towards each other or away from each other. Next is destabilization of the fault lines, which can be due to human impact. Next is volcanic activity. Now, many volcanoes, when they erupt, a large amount of energy is released, and sometimes this can cause the trembling of the earth's surface. And finally, there are human-induced earthquakes, which are caused due to human activities like mining, extraction of minerals and gases without refilling the cavities from where they have been extracted, or some activities related to construction which can change the configuration of any place. How are the earthquake zones distributed across the earth? Now, as I've already said, most of the earthquake prone zones, they are along the active plate boundaries. So on land, there are two major zones where the earthquakes have been distributed. First is the Circum-Pacific Belt. Now, Circum-Pacific Belt is an active plate boundary where the Pacific plate is being submerged at both the ends. Now, this belt, it affects some of the most populated coastal regions around the Pacific Ocean, including countries like New Zealand, New Guinea, Japan, Aleutian Islands, Alaska, and the western coasts of both North America as well as South America. The seismic activity across this whole belt is not very uniform throughout. And there are various patches which are stable, while the other patches which are highly vulnerable towards earthquakes. Now, there is another name by which many of you must know this belt. Apart from earthquakes, this area also experiences high amount of volcanic activity. And that is why it is known as the Ring of Fire around the Pacific. That is the Pacific Ring of Fire. 68% of the global earthquakes, they occur in this region. So that is why it is one of the biggest region of earthquakes and volcanoes on the earth. After the Circum-Pacific Ring of Fire, we come to the Alpine Belt. That is starting from Himalayas on the eastern side going up till the Alps in Europe. And it also stretches to parts of Atlantic Ocean and can go up to Mexico. So it's a straight parallel to equator zone of earthquakes. So the energy released in this area amounts to 15% of the world's total. So 68% of all earthquakes, they come in the Pacific belt, and the 15% of those, they come in this alpine belt. So as I've already said, this belt extends parallel to the equator from Mexico across the Atlantic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea, from Alpine Caucasus ranges in southern Europe to the Caspian Sea, and ending at Himalayan mountains and the adjoining lands. So it is parallel to equator, traversing through multiple continents. So this is the region actually where Eurasian plate and Indian plus African plates are merging with each other. Now these were the land belts, that is the belts for which the effectivity can be seen on the lands. Apart from these, there are under ocean belts as well, and they coincide with the ridges, that is the oceanic ridges. Here they are mostly the diverging plates that are working, which are creating the ridges. So there is some movement of the plates, right? So because of that, we have seismic activity along the ocean ridges, including Arctic Ocean, Atlantic Ocean, the Western Indian Ocean, and the Rift Valley of East Africa. Now, Rift Valley of East Africa is the only on-land diverging plate activity that we see. Okay, rest all the on-land activities we see are those of colliding plates. You can see here very clearly the various belts of which we were talking about in the previous slides. First, we have the Circum-Pacific belt. Now, this belt, as you can see, is encircling the whole Pacific Ocean. We also have the Alpine Himalayan belt, which is almost parallel to the equator. Next, we have the Mid-Atlantic ridge. We have the ridges of East Pacific Ocean, Southern Pacific Ocean or the Southern Ocean, and even in the Western Indian Ocean. You can see in the next map here the various magnitudes of the earthquakes that have occurred over the past between 1900 to 2017. You will see that the earthquakes of maximum intensity, they have occurred in the Circum-Pacific area. You can see it over here, how the earthquakes of the highest intensity, they have mostly occurred in the Circum-Pacific area. There are many earthquake zones along the Alpine belt, and you can see here and here that even in the ridge areas, which we saw in the previous maps, there have been occurrences of earthquakes. You can clearly see here that the zones of earthquakes, they are matching the various plate boundaries. So boundaries of earthquakes and the boundaries of the plates, they are matching. And that is why earthquake is the most talked about and most common natural disaster, because in most of the cases, the high magnitude earthquakes are only caused due to natural activities. Now, how is India vulnerable towards the earthquakes? The Bureau of Indian Standards has divided India into 4 zones, depending upon the risk that each zone experiences or possesses when it comes to earthquakes. About 59% of the total land area of the country is vulnerable to earthquake, making it very important for us to understand the reasons for their occurrence and how they can be mitigated. You can see here that the Himalayan zone, it either falls in zone 5, that is very high risk zone, or the high risk zone. Here you can see is the active boundary of the Himalayas, that is the Shivalik area. And here we have the Purvanchals. So these are the active boundaries, and that is why they have the highest risk towards earthquakes. Same goes for here, that is in Gujarat. You know about the Bhuj earthquake of 2001. Before this earthquake, we were not aware that even the Kutch region could be so susceptible towards the earthquakes. However, eventually it was realized that this area also belongs to the colliding zone, where Indian plate is meeting the Eurasian plate. So, zone 5 is the very high risk zone, and the zones near that, that is zone 4, is the high risk zone. So, active boundaries zone 5, areas surrounding the active boundaries are zone 4. Then we have zone 3 with moderate risk zone, and zone 2, that is the low risk zone. We know that the Deccan area and the central part of India, they are very stable areas. And that's why most of the places in this region belong to either zone 3 or zone 2. So this is the profile. This is the risk profile of India when it comes to earthquakes. Now let's take a look at what are the impacts of an earthquake event on the people, the property, and the environment. First of all, there is a loss of life. We know that a hazard becomes a disaster when we have a loss of life or property. Same goes for earthquake. If there is some amount of infrastructure that is present in an area, then it can get destroyed and people can get submerged under this rubble, and it can cause a loss of life. There is also damage to infrastructure, and it becomes very difficult for the people to live in that area if the damage is caused to the critical infrastructure. Next, there can be electrical short circuits which can cause fire or fire hazards or electrocution hazards. Now, earthquakes, they can also cause landslides. They can also be responsible for flash floods if the earthquakes impact especially the dams. Now, if the dams are broken because of any earthquake or dams are compromised, then the water from the dams, they can flood the surrounding areas and cause flash floods. Earthquakes can also be responsible for causing tsunamis. We know about the 2004 tsunami that hit the Indian subcontinent. We also know about the Great Tsunami of 2011 that hit the nation of Japan and caused the Fukushima disaster. Then the landslides that are associated with the earthquakes or even tsunamis, they can be responsible for some amount of land degradation. There can be the erosion of topsoil, or tsunamis can cause salt intrusions in the coastal areas. There is also a disruption of essential services when the critical infrastructure is hit. There can be deformation of ground or change in the slope parameters of the ground in that area. And this can also cause a change in the course of the rivers that usually flow in that area. Now, this change in river course can be both temporary due to a blockage, a temporary blockage of the river course, or it can also be permanent. An example of this permanent change can be that of River Po in Italy. In the 16th century, specifically in the year 1570, there came an earthquake of the magnitude around 5.8 on Richter scale in Italy. It caused a shift in the flow in the course of the river by 45 kilometers, and it shifted towards north. A temporary change can be River Mississippi. In 1811, an earthquake came in America, and between 1811 December till April 1812, the Mississippi River, it started flowing backwards because due to the earthquake, a large depression was formed in that area and the slope characteristic of the land it changed. So Mississippi, it started flowing in the backward manner. So there can also be a change in the river course, be it permanent or temporary due to earthquakes. Now, how earthquakes are managed in India? We have a National Center of Seismology under the Ministry of Earth Sciences, which has been declared as the nodal agency when it comes to monitoring of the earthquakes in and around the country. It has a network called the National Seismological Network, which has 115 laboratories. And this network, it provides the information regarding earthquakes to both the central government as well as the state governments so that they can prepare themselves for any kind of response or relief activities that are required after the earthquake has struck. Now we know that earthquake becomes a disaster only due to presence of infrastructure. There is a loss of property due to the loss of the infrastructure, and people also get submerged under all this rubble, and there is a loss of life as well. So that is why the National Earthquake Risk Mitigation Project, it basically focuses upon strengthening the structural and non-structural mitigation efforts. Structural are those related to tangible changes, and non-structural are those related to non-tangible changes or mainly the policy, training and awareness related activities. The earthquake disaster risk indexing is done by NDMA to identify the key cities which are susceptible to the earthquakes and how mitigation efforts can be taken up in these areas. The seismic microzonation, in fact, has also been done by the Geological Survey of India for all the cities that have a population greater than 5 lakh. There is also a national retrofitting program or a national retrofit program by the Ministry of Home Affairs to modify the existing structures, mostly the public infrastructure buildings, to make them resistant to any kind of seismic activities. What is retrofitting? Example, a building has already been made. So you cannot destroy the building and then make it according to the latest building standards. You instead work on it after it has already been constructed. So it is called retrofitting, working on a building to strengthen it after it has already been constructed in the past. There is also the launch of India Quake app. This app, it has the aim to disseminate earthquake related information to the people in a real time. Apart from that, another non-structural measure that has been taken by RBI is that it has given instructions to banks to deny the loans for any buildings which are not following the earthquake resistant building codes. Finally, we have various NDMA guidelines which have been issued to ensure that the earthquake related risk is mitigated. Now, what are these guidelines? These guidelines, they are based on 6 pillars of seismic safety. The first pillar is having earthquake resistant design and construction of new structures which follow these earthquake resistant building codes. Now there are various codes that have been given by BIS, that is Bureau of Indian Standards, by Building Material and Technology Promotion Council and HUDCO, Housing and Urban Development Corporation. So they have given certain standards which the buildings need to follow in case They are being constructed in an earthquake risk zone. The seismic strengthening and retrofitting of lifeline and priority structure, what we called critical infrastructure. Examples can be water purification plants, electricity distribution plants, which are essential for a normal life in any area. Then there needs to be regulation and enforcement of these codes which are being given in any particular area. It needs to be ensured that the new buildings that are coming up or the buildings that already exist, they are very up to date regarding the building standards. Next, there is a need to create public awareness on safety and risk reduction. NDMA, in fact, has multiple campaigns going on in this regard itself. Now we have created public awareness. The next pillar talks about capacity development. Public is aware, but the stakeholders who will be undertaking the response and rescue operations, they also need to be properly trained. So there needs to be a capacity building program that includes education, training, research and development, and documentation of various exercises and safety rules that need to be followed in the earthquake prone zones. Lastly, there is a need for effective emergency response that needs to be coordinated with the local administration, because the local administration would be the first one to respond to any such disaster. So there needs to be a coordination between the local administration and the other stakeholders who are undertaking emergency response activities. You can see a very good example over here. How a different type of land on which any building is constructed can affect its safety, and why there is a need for different building codes for different areas depending upon the condition of the land. If you see that there is an earthquake, both the buildings, they are equidistant from the hypocenter. However, this building has been constructed on a soft ground. Now, the soft ground will always experience a violent rumbling. Because the rumbling will be violent, that is, the magnitude of earthquake that is experienced in that land would be higher. So, the building will shake violently. Compare that to the building which has been constructed on a stable ground or bedrock. The soil conditions are good, and because of that, the rumbling that will be felt over here would be sharp, but it will not be as violent as is faced in the soft ground area. So accordingly, the building standards, they are established to ensure that depending upon the area, each building, it follows the basic rules regarding earthquake safety. Here are some basic rules that need to be followed. Starting from the bottom, you need to first have a stiff foundation. The foundation is the most important part of any building, right? So that foundation needs to be good and solid. Next, there should be good connection between the walls and the foundation. So this is the foundation, and here we are constructing the walls, the vertical walls. These walls should be nicely connected with the foundation. There should also be a good connection at the wall corners. They should also be properly connected. The walls should also have small openings so that they are not very susceptible to breaking down in case of any earthquake. We know that any kinds of cracks or openings in rocks and grounds make them very susceptible to natural forces. So similarly, the walls in such buildings which are in the earthquake zones, they should be small. There should be lintel bands in these buildings. There should be good connection between the roof and the walls, And the roof should be such that it stays together as a single unit during earthquake. Because if it has multiple parts, again the same problem will occur and the roof will give away and very easily. So the roof should stay as a single unit during any earthquake event. So these are the essential requirements in any masonry building in the earthquake zones. Apart from these measures, certain other measures like hazard and vulnerability mapping and land use regulation can also be taken up so as to ensure that the earthquake hazard does not turn into a disaster. We have already done hazard and vulnerability mapping in India. There are also rules for land use regulation, but for both of these, it is very essential that enforcement should be in place. They are properly regulated and they are properly enforced. And for this, capacity building of the local government officials, which are actually responsible to ensure the building codes are followed, it is essentially needed. What are the critical areas of concern when it comes to earthquake management in India? We have already studied about what all steps we have taken, what all other steps we need to take for earthquake management. But in India, what are the gaps that we are facing when it comes to earthquake management? First of all, there is a lack of awareness amongst various stakeholders about the seismic risk in any place that they are living in. Stakeholders can be citizens, governments, they can be NDRF forces or other volunteers, the CSOs, the NGOs, and so on, right? So there is a lack of awareness amongst various stakeholders when it comes to seismic risk. Also, when it comes to structural safety, not much attention is given to structural mitigation measures in the engineering education syllabus and courses. There is inadequate monitoring and enforcement of earthquake resistant building codes in India because the lack of capacity of the local governments. Also, the town planning bylaws are not very strictly followed. There is a lot of illegal, haphazard construction, especially in the urban areas and the urban rural fringe areas. Also, we do not follow any system of licensing of engineers and masons. So, they do not have any particular training regarding the construction requirements in various areas. For example, in the Zone 2 area, the requirements of earthquake resistant buildings might not be as strict as those being followed in Zone 5 areas. But because we do not follow any licensing system amongst engineers and masons, they are also not aware of any such discrepancies between the areas. There is also an absence of earthquake resistant features in non-engineered construction in suburban and rural areas. Now, not all buildings are built by engineers. Many buildings are built by people who have not gone through any formal education. So these non-engineered buildings, they are not strictly following any codes. So there is an absence of earthquake resistant features in such buildings, which are mostly found in the suburban areas or in the rural areas, making them susceptible when it comes to disasters like earthquakes. Also, there is a lack of formal training amongst the various professionals regarding earthquake resistant constructional processes. So, in the engineering syllabus, we lack any such education. Moreover, there is no formal training of the professionals later on for any such thing. We also do not have any licensing process for the engineers and the masons. Lastly, there is a lack of adequate preparedness and response capacity amongst the various stakeholder groups when it comes to earthquake response and relief measures. Because of lack of this, the relief measures can be slowed down and the amount of casualties it might increase, especially in the cases where the major earthquake is followed by multiple aftershocks. So we have already studied about inadequate enforcement of the codes. There is a lack of training of the stakeholders, lack of awareness amongst the citizens. And lastly, there is an insufficient or inadequate funds, specifically with the local governments, to ensure that proper regulation of the building codes and the enforcement of building codes exist. Plus, there is retrofitting in the critical infrastructure or priority sector infrastructure in these areas to ensure that they do not succumb and in case of any earthquake disaster. Now, what should be the way forward when it comes to India and earthquakes? We need to learn lessons from Japan. Now, Japan, it lies on the circum-Pacific ring of fire. And it is a country which experiences multiple earthquakes throughout the year. And because of this experience, Japan right now is considered as a gold standard when it comes to earthquake and tsunami mitigation and response. What are the various lessons we can learn from them? One is building codes and ensuring that those building codes are followed. Early warning systems specifically for disasters like tsunamis, which come after the earthquakes and which can be detected, and such early warning can save a lot of lives. Timely response after the disaster has struck, and tax incentives for buildings that are compliant with the building codes. So not only punitive measures of enforcement need to be taken, but we need to also incentivize the building owners to ensure that these codes are being followed. We also need to have a better mitigation plan to ensure that the earthquakes do not cause many casualties and a lot of infrastructure destruction. Under this mitigation plan, we need to enforce zonation codes and building codes. And we need to train people as to what do they need to do in case a disaster strike, in case they feel the tremors. There should be some buildings that are very resistant to earthquakes and which can be used as temporary shelters in case the disaster strikes. The critical buildings or the critical infrastructure needs to be protected. And finally, the response teams should have enough technology and financial resources and training to ensure that the response and rescue process is quick. We need to have a strong EIA, that is Environment Impact Assessment, specifically to prevent any kind of human-induced earthquakes. We know about the Koyna Dam earthquake, right? In Maharashtra, which was a dam-induced earthquakes. So if proper EIA studies are done, we can ensure that at least human-made earthquakes do not occur. Lastly, adequate amount of funding is required so as to ensure that such training programs and such mitigation measures can be put into place, especially in areas that lie in Zone 5 and Zone 4 of earthquake risk zonation mapping. Let us now come to the previous year questions that have been asked in UPSC mains regarding earthquakes. So the first question is from the year 2015. The frequency of earthquakes appears to have increased in the Indian subcontinent. However, India's preparedness for mitigating their impact has significant gaps. Discuss the various aspects. For this question, you start with the introduction, where you can mention that almost 59% of India's land is susceptible to the impact of earthquake disasters because India lies at the alpine belt of earthquakes. Now comes the body part. In the body part, you will first justify the first line. That is, the frequency of earthquakes has appeared to increase. Here you can first say that we already lie on the alpine belt of earthquakes, which experiences 15% of the total earthquakes of the world. Second, and the Shivalik area plus the Gujarat Kutch area, they are on the active boundaries. Secondly, the human activities in these regions has also increased. Now we have already said that unless there is the presence of any kind of infrastructure, the earthquake hazard will not turn into disaster, right? Now that the human activities have increased in these areas, which were previously inaccessible to human beings, that's why the earthquake, from being just a hazard, has now turned into a disaster. Third, there has also been poor planning on the part of human beings. We are not following proper zonations. We are not following proper building codes. And also, we are involved in a large amount of mining that can again cause earthquakes. Finally, you can mention that with the improvement in technology, we have a lot of seismic instruments that are very sensitive towards trembling of the earth's surface, and that's why more and more earthquakes are being recorded since the past few years or the past few decades. In the second part of the answer, you need to talk about the gaps in India's preparedness for mitigating the impacts of earthquakes. You can talk about first the building codes, which are already put in place by the Bureau of Indian Standards, HUDCO, and Building Material and Technology Promotion Council. However, these codes are not properly regulated and enforced. Same goes for regulation and enforcement of the zonings or zonation. That is earthquake zonation and accordingly earthquake zonation planning. And because of this, both the public and the private infrastructure is at risk when it comes to earthquakes. Also, the increase in load of population has increased the risk when it comes to earthquake as a disaster. Next, you can also talk about inadequate search and rescue forces. At present, we only have 15 battalions in NDRF. In each battalion, we have 18 teams of 45 personnel. So that is the whole amount of National Disaster Response Force that we have in the country as of now. For a country with a population 1.4 billion, we only have a few thousand people who are properly trained in search and rescue operations. So it is inadequate. We also have inadequacy when it comes to awareness generation and training. We also do not have in place any program that uses or that aims to explore the traditional knowledge of the people who have been living in the earthquake-prone zones for centuries. There is a lack of community involvement. So the community people, they don't feel like a stakeholder when it comes to disaster management programs. They feel only like victims, and they feel they do not have any power to control the impact of any such events. Lastly, due to inadequate funding, we have problems in capacity building, in training programs, and also in research and development to develop various technologies for either early warning system or to ensure that the building codes, they adhere to specific Indian standards. So these are the various drawbacks or the gaps in the India's preparedness for mitigating the impact of earthquakes. Finally, in the conclusion, you can mention at a positive note that even though we have multiple gaps in our mitigation process or earthquake management process, we are still taking multiple steps to ensure that these gaps are closed. Then you can mention the few steps like we have already done through BIS earthquake zonation. The Geological Survey of India has already mapped the risk faced by cities with more than 5 lakh population. Then NDMA also has multiple awareness generation and training programs for the various stakeholders. So in the conclusion, you can mention this and end your answer at a positive note. Let's go to the next question. It came in the year 2021. Discuss about the vulnerability of India to earthquake-related hazards. Give examples including the salient features of major disasters caused by earthquakes in different parts of India during the last 3 decades. Last 3 decades, that is from 1991 till the year 2021. Now, first of all, you need to discuss how India is vulnerable. So, in the introduction, you can mention that India has 59% of its total land which faces very high to high risk when it comes to earthquake hazards. Then you come to body. In the body, you will first mention how India is vulnerable. First, you will talk about the alpine belt and India's location in this belt, which increases its vulnerability. Second, you will talk about India's population, and because of high density of population, any small hazard can turn into a disaster. Third, the economic vulnerability and the social vulnerability of the people is very high in the country, and that makes it difficult for the people to cope up from any such kind of a hazard. So, India is vulnerable in those aspects as well. So, we have talked about physical vulnerability, population level vulnerability, also economic and social vulnerability. Apart from that, we'll talk about how the high and very high risk areas are mostly in the mountainous regions, and that is why there is a chance of secondary disasters that can hit that area after an earthquake has already happened. We have disasters like landslides, also tsunamis, especially in Andaman and Nicobar Island area. So these 4 points will cover the first part of your body. In the second part, you need to give examples of the various disasters that have struck with a few features related to those earthquake disasters. Here we only need to talk about the major events. There have been hundreds and thousands of earthquake events that have occurred in the past 3 decades, but we'll talk about only a few major events. First, we'll talk about the Latur earthquake of 1993. Now, Latur does not exist at the active plate boundary. So, that's why this area It had not experienced an earthquake before. So they were not very well prepared when it came to earthquake. It affected various districts in Maharashtra as well as Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka. And it was actually caused due to intraplate movement and caused destruction of almost 80 villages. Second is the Chamoli earthquake of the year 1998. Now this earthquake, it occurred in the state of Uttarakhand, and it was followed by a multiple series of landslides which blocked the area from the other parts of the country for many days. Third, we'll talk about the Bhuj earthquake of 2001. It was one of the most devastating earthquake which occurred on the Republic Day of the year 2001. So again, this area was not a conventionally known area for earthquakes, and after this event, it was finally understood that even the Kutch area, it belongs to this alpine zone of earthquakes. Next, we have the 2004 earthquake, which led to a tsunami. Before 2004, Indians did not even know about something called a tsunami. And this tsunami event or the earthquake event of the 2004 was actually responsible to push the Indian government to enact the Disaster Management Act of the year 2005. After this, in 2005, another earthquake hit Jammu and Kashmir. It was during the winter season, and because of that, it became very difficult to manage the situation in Kashmir. Because of the oncoming winter, a lot of people, they were displaced from their homes and they were living in the temporary shelters, and it became difficult to manage the situation. This earthquake, it also majorly affected parts of Pakistan and Afghanistan. After this, we did not have any major earthquake activities. However, in the year 2015, the Nepal earthquake, it also impacted areas of India, and it actually caused a lot of avalanches in the Himalayan regions surrounding Nepal or within Nepal. 2015 also saw an earthquake in Jammu and Kashmir where almost 800 people lost their lives. So this was the last earthquake related event, major earthquake related event in India, which caused a huge amount of casualties. So this is your answer. In conclusion, you can mention that India is highly vulnerable towards earthquakes, and since the enactment of the 2005 Disaster Management Act, we have taken various steps to ensure that the earthquake disasters do not have high level of impact on the life and property of the people. And you can actually see that happening because after 2005, no major earthquake related disaster has happened except the one in Kashmir in 2015.